Well, I would like to start and open by welcoming you all to the first, as Rafni mentioned, of our joint events with the Royal Society of Queensland. It's my pleasure to open this afternoon's session of Fire in the Landscape, an expert panel and public forum. I don't think any of us would be surprised that fire plays an important role across Queensland and Australia more broadly. And I believe this afternoon's session will be providing hopefully some very valuable insights to its impacts and how we need to be working with it moving forward. Before we do get started, though, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we are all meeting this afternoon. For those of us here in the room at Spring Hill, that's the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples, and we acknowledge their connections to land, cultures and sky, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The way in which we'll be running this afternoon, we'll be having around 20-minute long sessions with each of our presentations, followed by a period for questions. For those here in the room, please raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask, and for those on Zoom, please do throw that into the meeting chat. We will have myself or another moderator helping communicate those to everyone here in the room. Beyond that, we'll then have a bit of a break around 2:45, 3:15 for afternoon tea, and then we will wrap up with our panel discussion around 4 p.m. I don't want to take too much more time, though. Let's dive straight into it, and we'll throw to Rafni.
As John said, speakers will have 20 minutes, followed by 15 questions, and a break at 2:45. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. So Professor Patrick Moss may have been known to some of you, I think. Patrick is the head of school at QUT, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. Patrick will tell you about himself as he goes through his presentation, but his area really is paleoecology. Very interesting, including fire ecology. And I think today Patrick's presentation is a view from academia to start us off, which I think will form a good introduction and a background to our other two speakers. So would you please join me in welcoming Patrick?
Thanks, Rafni, and thanks for inviting me to present, and both the Royal Society and Royal Geographical Society of Queensland as well. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of the view from academia. Again, one of the key things is trying to move out of the ivory tower and sort of work with managers and policymakers as well. And that's one of the key aspects of that as well. So I've been at QUT since February. So I was at UQ up almost 20 years. So I've moved down the river as well, and basically moved into a new school, which is the Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. So obviously has that connection with geography through Earth, but atmospheric sciences is sort of focusing on atmospheric physics and chemistry. So there's a lot of interest in sort of aerosols and other things that sort of emerge from fires as well. But yeah, so relatively new to QUT. All right. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners as well. So the Turrbal and Yuggera. Also the traditional custodians from several of the sites I'm going to mention in today's talks. So Quandamooka in particular, Kayardild people as well from Gulf of Carpentaria. And obviously that plays a really important role in terms of fire history in Australia, which I'll come back to. And I'll try and keep to 20 minutes. I might be a little bit over, but I've got a bit to go through. So I've done the academic thing for too many slides. So I apologise for that in first instance as well. So what I'm going to do, go back to sort of first principles in fire ecology, and that's the fire triangle. It's a really important conceptual framework to understand the complexity with fire, and it is a really complex topic as well. So that's the one reason why I want to sort of bring it up. Then I'll move on to some of my key research areas. So a longer term perspective, so looking at quaternary aridity, so it's aridity development of arid environments over the last 600, 700,000 years. Human arrival, so First Nations people, and the various impacts and debates associated with that. More contemporary perspectives, so European fire management, and then sort of move on to the future. So in particular, climate change and Indigenous knowledge and the roles they probably play in adapting to a rapidly changing environment across Australia. My examples are pretty much all from Queensland as well, so I've sort of kept it in state as well, but I've got other projects in Tasmania in particular, Southeast Asia, Indonesia as well, but I'm primarily focusing on Queensland examples. So the fire triangle basically summarizes how fire operates in the landscape. So you need oxygen, and it's pretty 20% atmospheric oxygen concentration is pretty standard. Has changed in the past, but not that we really need to worry about it. But I guess the influence of that is wind. So wind blowing more air in and oxygen and promoting ignition. Heat, so ignition sources, so both natural and human sources, which I'll come back to, and then fuel. So that's the vegetation itself. Its links to climate, so rainfall and precipitation and temperature is really important as well. And in many respects, we can sort of understand fire regimes in terms of those basic principles, but obviously with a lot of complexities. So if you look at lightning patterns, you'll start to see key patterns emerging where we see more lightning in tropical and subtropical regions, decreasing as we head to the poles. You notice some areas such as sort of Central Africa and Amazonian region, which have a lot of lightning strikes, but not a lot of fire. And that reflects the fact that you've got high precipitation that limits burning as well. But when we move into the savanna country of Northern Australia, we have these dry periods, so the drying out. So those lightning sources are really important in terms of understanding global fire regimes. So even before people, these would have been relatively fire-prone environments as well. So again, you see that pattern in terms of the incidence and frequencies of fire. So really high in Northern Australia in that savanna country as well. Now that isn't a lightning strike. That's actually on Bendick Island, Gulf of Carpentaria. That was a fire started by a traditional custodian, basically to manage the landscape. So that's the other factor that comes into play with ignition sources. So, and again, you see a lot of concerns with climate change, with dry lightning down in temperate Australia, and climate change as well, impacting fire regimes through there as well. We also have key different types of fires. So we have our surface fires, which is the most common. So generally burning the grassy understory, generally cooler fires. Our crown fires, which tend to be the more devastating bushfires, particularly down in Victoria, where I grew up. And I do remember Ash Wednesday and basically as a teenager, the leaves from my backyard, good 20 to 30 kilometres away from the fire fronts that were occurring there as well. And this is where the aerial structures are being burnt, and generally much more devastating than surface fires. Again, I've crossed over on Bendick Island. I've literally jumped over the surface fire there, where you wouldn't even think about it in a mountain ash environment in Victoria, for instance. And then ground fire, which is much rarer, but it's where highly organic peaty soils start to burn. Major issue in places like Indonesia, but I was at a recent presentation in Tasmania where they had a organic ground fire occurring that took several weeks to put out as well. So it can last for a long time period. So again, that's a photo from Bendick Island. A surface fire, again, you can jump over it. It's not full fire, it's just burning the understory. You can still see the remnants of the grassland behind that. And generally associated with probably a typical First Nations fire management strategy as well. Crown fire, so that's from Wilson's Promontory. So you see the devastation of the forest there, basically, which is being burned. Much hotter, much more intense fire. And then these are some examples from Indonesia. So we have peat forest. A lot of that was converted to rice plantation or rice farms in the 1990s as part of the fire. And they dried out, and basically you see the peaty soils coming alive. Major issues in terms of aerosols as well. And the Indonesian government's recognised that and are restoring about 2 million hectares of peatland environments in Indonesia at the moment as well. So generally not a big issue for us, but there are certain parts of Australia where it will be an influence. And the other key concept is the fire regime. So this is the pattern, frequency and intensity of fire. Linked to that fire triangle, we see the influence of fuel. So fuel management is often, you probably get discussion points about that, is one of the key ways in which we can reduce risk. and hazards associated with fire. Ignition, so I guess using humans, that's an ignition source. And climate is the other one that we can't really control, and the major influence that we'll see moving forward in the rest of the 21st century and beyond. And changes in fire regimes can fundamentally alter a landscape and create what are referred to as disclimate communities. And I'll point to an example from Tasmania shortly, but it's the key tool that a manager can shape. And again, you'll have examples of that. And key terms you might come across is fire intensity, so the amount of energy released by the fire severity, the amount of vegetation that's been damaged or destroyed, and burnt severity, where is the amount of organic material lost from the soil. And for instance, we have relatively low fire regimes in the wet tropics. You've got high fuel loads, a lot of vegetation, but it generally doesn't dry out, so it doesn't burn. And contrast, if we look at arid parts of Australia, reverse situation, you don't necessarily have a lot of fuel load because you don't have a lot of vegetation, even though it's drier basically as well. So generally, probably our most devastating fires, and again, coming from Victoria, is around that sort of Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia areas. That's where we get high intensity crown fires, which do a lot of damage. Serious concern in Queensland, but again, it was a major concern, say, in Victoria growing up in those issues in those areas as well. And then season is also really important. So the dry season plays a key role. So you basically see it moving from winter in northern parts of Australia down to sort of summer and autumn in Tasmania, basically reflecting the driest time of the year. We've also got other climatic variability, so El Nino events, La Nina events will all contribute to fire regimes as well over the longer time cycles. So that basically gives you an overview of some of the key concepts that I sort of want to touch on. One side I want to mention and have worked on this side is Surrey Hills. This is where Rhys Jones, a famous archaeologist, developed his fire stick farming hypothesis. The greatest estate on Earth, so Bill Gamage, Bruce Pascoe also used this as an example area. And it's a disclimax environment. So you'll notice in the foreground, white grass land, so open landscape. In the background, you have rainforest. Climatically, this should all be rainforest. But you have this mix of different vegetation types, which reflects, most likely, there's a bit of debate, but most likely First Nations fire management, basically. So burning it at different scales and creating these open landscapes, basically. And they might be for hunting game. There's also eucalypt forest there for other resources and the rainforest for other resources as well. And there's been some modelling done on this. So this is sort of the A landscape of this model is what the landscape looks like today. So you see a mix of rainforest, button grass moorland, so rainforest is the green, eucalypt forest and so on, so sort of mixed vegetation. And then basically it transitions to C, which is what happens if we remove Indigenous fire management. And so you see basically rainforest taking over as well. So it's a really important example to show the importance of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous fire management in the landscape. And we are seeing evidence of this. So this is a button grass moorland, a grassy area where we've got needle leaf coming up, needle shrub coming up and taking over basically with the cessation of Indigenous fire management. And that's a common thread across all of Australia. So I'll come back to that with some examples a bit closer to home. Now, the triangle concept is a really useful concept. So not only can we sort of apply it to contemporary fire management and future fire management, we can also look at past perspectives. So as I mentioned, in terms of atmosphere, oxygen, around 20% has been pretty constant for hundreds of millions of years. There were periods in the past where it was below modern day values. So we had a decrease in fire and even higher in the past as well, but around 300 million years ago. So it's not a factor at the moment or with here. I guess winds and changing wind patterns would be the key factor of that as well. But the key thing that we can focus on this is vegetation and climate and sort of the evolution of new vegetation and climate change coming into play. So one of the areas that I've worked on extensively, and this has sort of formed the basis of my PhD and still undertaking ongoing work, is the wet tropics of northeast Queensland. So Atherton, Tableland, Cairns and that area. And we see really clear landscape divides here, which reflect climatic patterns. So we have savanna country, sort of around Mareeba, where you have open landscapes, eucalypt forest or eucalypt woodland, and fire is much more common in that landscape. Pretty closely aligned to the 1500 millimetre rainfall line. So basically, you have more than that, you have rainforest, less than that, you have savanna country. A couple of exceptions, but that's the general case. Rainforests are generally much lower fire regimes. Mangroves, which I won't go into. But we also have this area of wet sclerophyll forest, which is in the lee side of the Eastern Highlands. So orographic rainfall basically dries it out slightly. So we have a canopy of eucalypt forest and rainforest understory basically there as well. And we also have another picture of this, and this is what my PhD supervisor, Peter Kershaw, found, was that dry Araucarian rainforest, dry gymnosperms, which disappeared around about 45,000 years ago as well, and generally associated with people, basically, in this part of the world. So one of my focus of my PhD was looking at marine cores, which provide vegetation records over long time scales, so particularly ODP 820, which is just off Cairns, off the Grafton Passage. So the ODP 820, ODP stands for Ocean Drilling Program, and basically it's a 400-metre long core. I've looked at, I think it's the top 130, 140 metres of it, which goes back around about 600,000 years. But the record can go much longer than that. But what we see over that 600,000 year time period is evidence of increased aridity. So initially, around about 500,000 years ago, we see this increase in charcoal, so increased burning. So this is well before people are on the scene. We then see a subsequent change at around about 270,000 years, where we see a decline in pteridophytes or ferns, and then a further decline about 170,000 years ago. We also see palms disappearing from the scene. And then what brought me into the PhD was basically this charcoal peak at around about 130,000 years ago. So there have been attempts to push back human arrival to this time period. Peter Kershaw, actually, when he looked at a coarser resolution of this, linked that to people and said that this reflects people arriving 130,000 years ago. Didn't match up with the archaeology. We're getting closer, 60,000, but we're not 130,000 years as well. But what we see with this event is there's a natural change in a natural peak in charcoal, a natural occurrence, basically. And I'll get back to the reason for that as well. And then over the last 40 to 50,000 years, increased burning. And that is what I would associate with people. So there is a role, but the relative roles of that is still up for a lot of debate as well. We see this in other forms of vegetation as well. So we see the disappearance of the, or decline in the rainforest gymnosperm category that you can see there. So that's that Araucarian bunya hoop pine forest that has declined over that time period, particularly over the last 40,000 years ago. And we also have an increased occurrence of she oaks and native pines before that sort of 270,000 year time period. So Australia's drying out, the key take-home message of that over that time period. Why is it drying out? There's a lot of possible reasons for that. So Australia's drifting northwards about 6 centimetres per year and might have hit a sort of tipping point where sort of Australia started to dry out because of moving into sort of under the pressure of the atmospheric high pressure systems. There was also a change in glacial cycle events. So they're controlled by, I won't go into too much detail, but basically they're controlled by Earth's relationship orbital parameters around the sun. So we've seen a shift from about 41,000 year warm wet interglacials to cool dry glacials that were around about 1 million years ago to 100,000 year driven by changes in Earth's orbital shape, basically. So that may play a role. That may also play in the role in the development of the Great Barrier Reef as well. That's another story. The other thing we will also observe is the potential for El Nino Southern Oscillation. So over that time period, we may have seen the development of the West Pacific warm pool, so an area of warm water over northern Papua New Guinea, which is the key driver in El Nino events, basically. So basically sloshes across the Central Pacific, reverses the trade winds. So the southeasterly trade winds basically blow towards South America. They have floods, we have drought. La Nina events, it intensifies, basically. So over that time period, we seem to have the conditions that are suitable for that to develop. and it's linked to a potential 30,000 year ENSO cycle. So maybe El Nino Southern Oscillation switches on every 30,000 years, linked to changes in Earth's orbital parameters. And that's one of the things I found out of my PhD. But again, there's lots of other factors come into play as well. It's not just observed in the marine record, but we also see this in the faunal record at Rockhampton and Mount Etna, and may have occurred a bit earlier in southern Australia, so around about the million-year mark as well. But it's that important context for anthropogenic fire regime. So Australia was drying out, becoming more fire-prone, and this is the environment that First Nations people experienced. So this is work by Scott Hocknell, who was working in Mount Etna. So basically around 300,000 years ago, he went from rainforest fauna, so things like tree kangaroos, couscous, range of cassowaries and those type of things in Rockhampton, to bilbies. So not even going to savanna animals, actually going to desert, arid animals basically as well. And it happened like that as well. And there's a number of sites of sort of observing that drying trend across Australia as well. So people arrived on the scene around about 60,000 years ago, 65,000 years ago. We have recent evidence of people arriving from North Stradbroke Island at 50,000 years ago, which I'll come back to shortly. And this provides that new ignition source. Now, there are debates linked to that, which I'm not going to go into detail with megafauna extinction and landscape change. There are key camps in academia. So you've got people who say it's all down to people, other people say it's climate, and people such as myself who think it's a bit of both. Sitting on the fence, basically. But there are important implications for that as well. If you're losing your large herbivores, which are eating a lot of plant material, that's going to impact fuel loads, then vegetation as well. But also we have tens of thousands of years of Indigenous fire management, which I think is important to link up to. So they've experienced dramatic climate change and other environmental change as well, and they've adapted to those processes through their fire management schemes as well. And then that provides a setting for subsequent European settlement. So this is other work that we did on South Walker Creek in central Queensland. ODP 820 comes up there, but you see the increase in charcoal, decline in vegetation associated with megafauna extinction there as well. So we think it's climate degradation occurring in this case. People probably played a role, but it seems to be that sort of combination coming through to play. And then there's a range of sites coming through reflecting sort of increased aridity, people being on the scene, and that combination resulting in megafauna extinction. And again, it makes a lot more sense. If people were in Australia 60,000 years ago, you've got a 20,000 year time overlap with megafauna as well. So something sort of came together around about 40,000 years that caused them to come extinct. This is Minjerribah. So this is recent work that came out, and the key point of that is that we've got artefacts that we date to about 50,000 years. So we've got people in southeast Queensland 50,000 years ago from this site on Minjerribah as well. And that shows you what southeast Queensland looked like 20,000 years ago with lower sea level. So Minjerribah, Stradbroke Island, Moreton Island were part of the mainland, similar to Kalula, and you're probably about 20 to 30 kilometres out to hit the coast at that time period. And basically sea level rose at that time period, and people had to adapt to that. So this is the Canalpin Creek and basically the archaeological sites. That's one of the sites that we're focused on. So that's the excavation of Little Canalpin Creek as well. And we've got some interesting data that's emerged from here as well. So we've actually looked at pollen and charcoal directly from the archaeological site. And essentially we see some really interesting changes coming to play that sort of, I think, demonstrate the influence of people. So what you'll notice in the sort of top section of the core last 6,000 years, large amounts of melaleuca, paperbark, probably reflecting rise in sea level and development of coastal communities as sea level has risen. High amounts of eucalypts, so probably about 10,000 years or thereabouts, and high amounts of grass, so open landscape basically occurring there. If we go back and then increase burning or increase pteridophytes there as well. If we go back 150,000 years from the dates there, we see much higher amounts of banksia, minimal grass, and eucalypts are a lot less evident. They're there, and particularly melaleuca as well. So it does seem to be a change there in this deposit. from a sort of pre-human to post-human environment as well, sort of demonstrating the potential influence of that of the environment. And we see this at Native Companion Lagoon, which is on North Stradbroke Island as well. So this record goes back about 45,000 years. We have a charcoal peak there, which matches up with a number of sites there, so increased burning. Another one over the last 5,000 years, and there's a big debate in Australia about intensification of human occupation and more people, more impact on the landscape as well. So that fits in nicely with that pattern, although I could give you other records that shows different stories. So peaks at 20,000 years and the other peaks at 12,000 years. What the take-home message of that, and I think we can probably link this with people, but it suggests that people are probably impacting different parts of the landscape in different ways. So we've got to be really careful about sort of generalising impacts and sort of take a more landscape approach. And we're starting to get areas such as North Stradbroke Island when we start to assess that as well. So while I say there's probably a human component here as well, this is probably where people are hanging around. There are other parts of the island where they mightn't have been visiting as commonly, and we don't see the same signals there as well. And the final one I want to mention is Jumping Grass Marsh. So this is actually located in Dunwich, and really clear site indicating the impacts of European fire suppression. So it's with the old high school, which is now the kayak officers, so the traditional native title holders of the island. And basically we collected a 2.5 metre sediment core. So it's one of my key tools of the trade. So it's a nice peat core that's been dated to around about 27,000 years. Really interesting, the fact that it's continuous peat deposition over that time period. So it's pretty unique for that reason. But we had a really interesting change around about 9,000 years ago in terms of charcoal. So you see much higher amounts prior to 9,000 years dropping off. I didn't have those dates, so I thought it was sort of pre-European versus post-European, but I was only out by about 9,000 years basically in my estimates. But what it actually reflects is that's the time period when Stradbroke Island wasn't an island, it was part of the mainland. And sea levels rose and flooded all of the eucalypt forests and other vegetation communities that were in Moreton Bay at that time period, and we saw a lowering of burning basically there as well. And interesting enough, I had discussions with Quandamooka people, and they said, yeah, we can remember the stories about camping out there and interacting on Moreton Bay when it was dry land at that time period as well. This is a pollen record. One of the interesting aspects, we've got evidence of high palm, so potential refugia for rainforest at that time period. And there's really interesting change around about 9,000 years ago, which is where it increased. So we see increased burning and probably reflecting the fact that water tables were changing and things sort of came unravelled. So often when we go from one state to another state, we do see changes in fire regimes and evidence of that in terms of carbonised particles coming through there as well. I've also seen that at Gari, at Moon Point, same change about the same time period where sea level changes. So basically it's suggesting change in water tables, things are drying out, and basically vegetation has started to burn at that time period as well. But the reason why this site's also really interesting is through aerial photography, we can actually see the influence of fire suppression. So this is an image of it in 1955, and what you see is a fairly open landscape. By 1967, you can start to see paper bark coming through, and then we see the situation today where about a third of the marsh is actually dominated by paper bark. It's got the bats, flying foxes in there as well, but it's invading that landscape. And again, that's that vegetation thickening that I'm seeing at other parts of southeast Queensland and central Queensland as well. So that's fire suppression basically there. We can estimate changes here. That's just the map sort of showing the land change. But it's basically about a third over about a 50-year time frame of that marsh being replaced by paper bark forest as well. And the final site is 18 Mile Swamp that we've got some really interesting data that's just emerged. So this is a really super high resolution record. It goes back 2 metres and covers about the last 400 years. So we're getting down to sub-decadal resolution, which is very rare in my line of research. So it's really important. So what we've done is looked at large fragments of charcoal, but also looked at geochemical signatures we basically X-rayed, and it gives us a whole range of geochemical proxies that we can use there. Key take-home point there is that we've got a clear change in the fire regimes there. We sort of have these constant burning, but relatively low impact. It lowers off, and then we have these big events occurring probably over the last 50 to 100 years. And that reflects the increase in fuel loads. And we're also seeing that in terms of titanium. So you're probably having these big events opening up the landscape. Titanium's blowing from the sand and being redeposited at the swamp. And zirconium is another one. You sort of see that change coming through, which might be reflecting that vegetation thickening as well. We also have this really interesting peak in calcium, which may reflect a tsunami. So there's a quantum story about tsunami impacting there as well. So we might be picking that up as well. But it's showing that evidence of changes in fire management. We also see it with a pollen diagram. And the key thing that we see here is that expansion in she oaks, casuarina. So that's expanded vegetation thickening. If you've been to Carbora, Blue Lake, the national park there, when it became, Quantum took it over, one of the first things they actually did was got rid of the she oaks in that environment as well, because they felt it was thickening the landscape and being a fire risk as well. And then we see this increase in pteridophytes, which are fern spores, so monolith fern spores and lygodium, which probably indicate the impacts of those big fire events that are hitting this landscape. And then charcoal increasing as well, which you can see there. So to summarise that, basically we've got clear impacts on Stradbroke Island of the cessation of quantum fire management. So we see a marked shift in that landscape, which is going to impact fire regimes. There's evidence of larger fires over the last 50 to 100 years. Now, they're going to be fuel load mediated. They're also going to be climate impacted. So climate change and global warming. And we're seeing much more devastating bushfires across Australia, but also globally as well. And they're reflecting that change from one climate state to another climate state as well. Weeds and exotic taxa are also an important impact. And it's a common feature, not just within Queensland, but also across Australia as well. So it's something we need to manage for, and I'm sure there'll be discussion points coming up with the other speakers as well. So I guess Indigenous knowledge can assist us with adapting to fire regimes. And I've had some interesting discussions with people, with a First Nations person from Kakadu, and already indicating that community is already changing their fire practices in response to climate change. So they're using that knowledge that's been generated over thousands of years to adapt to this changing environment and respond to that as well. And I guess that's one of my key interests of trying to bridge that gap for large areas of Australia as well. So I think that's my last slide. And yeah, so happy to take any questions.
Thank you. So we'll take questions from the floor, and we'll also check to see if there are any on the chat there. I'll bring this around for questions. Any questions?
Yeah, Patrick's probably not real keen to hear my questions. But anyway, Patrick, how can we actually come up with some figure on what the structural change in the lack of burning is producing, the change in climate, producing the extra intensity in fire and nickel carbon?
That's a big question. So it's probably downscaling it. And I think it's going to be different aspects in different parts of the environment as well. So while I'm saying we're seeing that in southeast Queensland, and in particular the areas that I'm sort of focusing on, wiregrass wetland systems. So the jumping grass is a wiregrass Empedisma minus. There's another one, a Moon Point, that I've been working on as well. And again, you can see that change. So you can actually map the process of that vegetation coming in, the paperbark and metaceous shrubs coming in and taking over through there as well. I think where climate change can come into play is probably fuel load. So you're going to have increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which will help and promote plant growth. So that's going to be a factor we need to take into account, but also increase that variability. And that's probably the more important factor as well. So I know in Tassie and other projects I've been involved in, we're seeing parts of that landscape which haven't burnt for thousands of years. So the rainforest there as well. So that's probably looking at those environments that shouldn't burn, that are burning now. I guess that's where we can start to characterize that as well. So we've had the vegetation thickening. I think that's occurring. We've got evidence of that, and that's that sort of change in management process. But where we're starting to get those landscapes that are burning, that haven't burned or not supposed to burn for long, long time periods, and repeatedly threatened. And I know a lot of the Tasmanian land managers are really concerned about that process as well. That's where I think we start to characterize those impacts. And we're seeing other parts of the globe, Canada, Siberia, and the fire season as well. It's just, I know talking to practitioners around that basically the window of burning and getting in control burns is just narrowing.
Which ironically, at a time when we really need to be doing a lot more, we appear to be doing a lot less.
Yes. Yeah. So, you've got a very narrow window to get the control burns in. And it may reflect different approaches as well, because you've probably got with First Nations groups, they're on the landscape constantly, they're burning it, they're existing it as well. And while, we tend to have this more top-down approach, I guess, than a bottom-up.
Social choking of our capacity to burn is what's keeping us under the.
Yeah, it's probably giving more license to burn, but it's a big thing, because if you look at and again, I came over from the British Isles and my ancestors came across there, so it's a different mindset, I guess, as well, that we've got to sort of come up to speed with.
Thanks, Patrick. That's all. Could you go back to your LCN twin pollen data slide, please? Could you help me understand a bit more about the casual record that's there?
A bit there, so this one.
Yeah, so that's relatively consistent over that data, and your students there, I think, showed it as well.
Yeah.
Can you explain why that is kind of consistent? And I know that you look backwards.
Yeah.
But looking forward, that looks like that trend's going to continue, right? Going back to Dave's point, that the Shio's casuarinas kind of do suppress fire unless it's probably at the upper end of its severity.
Yeah.
Are we likely to see kind of Shio thickening across the landscape as we've seen in Southern Australia?
It seems to be the one that's responding on Stradbroke Island, probably coastal areas, and that's because it's going to be the equestrifolia, Casuarina equestrifolia, which is the coastal one. So sea levels increase. It's adapted to saline environments and coastal environments. So that's probably one of the drivers. So you probably see it dipping a little bit. This probably isn't the ideal record, but if we probably push it back, you do see it lowering in the glacial maxima as well in other records here. I think this shows it. So you sort of see, particularly that peaking probably around about 30,000 years there as well, but particularly over the last 10,000 years as the island develops. And it's interesting because a lot of people don't think of Shio as they think it's sort of fire sensitive, but they do have adaptations. I guess the key impact it's having, because it's thick, dries out, it's going to burn basically when we have the droughts occurring.
And that takes out all the other vegetation and establishes planting and monoculture.
Yeah, I remember visiting Blue Lake National Park after Quandamooka sort of started to put traditional fire management in there, and it looked healthier. It just, they got rid of the sheoaks and they slashed them. They didn't burn them. They just slashed them basically through there as well. So different ways of managing the landscape as well. It doesn't necessarily mean applying more fire or fire in a particular way, but it might be using slashing and things like that.
Yeah, that was my other point. I think mechanical a rising price within from Alistair and where they see from.
Yeah.
I'm John Carter. Just wondering, how will the paleoclimate modelers, the paleoclimate people who do coral bombing cores and the paleobiology like you're doing, I wonder how well they are getting together. Is there a good integration in academia in this area? Integrating amongst themselves, I suspect.
So it is a bit of a chicken and egg argument. So there's a lot of work with paleoecologists and modelers as well, because one of the things that you get from paleoecology is not only can you test, you sort of hindcast. So this is probably more relevant if we're looking at deeper time, but I know I've had some work with modelers looking at Eocene environments 50 million years ago. This is the sort of warmest part of 65, 66 million years ago. And modelers are really interested in that time period because they can test their models, and if it works there, it just can work into the future. There's a lot of links and developments of things, and probably the other thing that's probably talking to managers. That's the key thing. I mean, we've got data sets here, and we can sort of demonstrate. Yeah, we've got vegetation thickening here occurring. It's clearly evident in the records, and it's coming across in different ways. So it's getting that information across as well, and the models are getting better. And you can actually see that the test of the model estimating temperature increases. So they've had those models running since the 1980s, and pretty much it's right in the middle of the temperature estimates of the model extremes as well. But it's really important to have those conversations. I guess I'm not sure whether that answers your question, but yeah.
Is the contribution of fire emissions to Australia's total greenhouse load?
Couldn't tell that off the top of my head. It's not a big major contribution. And actually, there's been a lot of work working with First Nations groups to create biochar to take carbon out. So you can actually use fire as a tool to reduce carbon emissions as well. I think most of it's sort of coming from fossil fuel use, in particular. Land change is probably the key factor. So you might use fire for deforestation and things like that and clearing the landscape. That would definitely have a contribution, and changing landscape from one state to another state as well. But direct emissions from bushfires and things like that would be a factor, but it's not going to be a crucial factor from, yeah.
2%.
Maybe less. I mean, again, it's more of that. Yeah, it's not going to be a significant factor as say fossil fuel use.
Just a lot of people think fire is bad.
Yeah.
But it can be good and bad.
Well, yeah, and the flip side of that is probably particulates and aerosol. So I think probably everyone's familiar with the burning off in August in Brisbane. We wait for the nice low no wind days. But if it settles into Brisbane, you get a lot of complaints about that as well. And that's one of the key factors, I guess, you have with burning off and doing that as well, in terms of the impact of that.
I can help you with that.
Yep.
Land emissions are about 550 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. That's a normal year. But in, say, the 2019 and 2020 bushfires, it was probably covered that. But to Patrick's point, the vegetation does recover and sequesters it back. So in the convoluted way that they calculate it, called LULUCF, which is land use change in forestry, they've actually calculated that most of it comes back from the trees, obviously reshooting, responding from the fire. But obviously there was a fair whack of emissions from about some of the bushfires because of the continental scale.
Did anyone notice the sky this morning? I think we've had a burn off. In Brisbane.
Hey, Nova catchment.
In Albury, wasn't it?
Sure it is.
Bit late.
So a quick lecture for some mentioned Patrick vegetation thing. Over what period are you really referring to, and what is your base evidence for that?
So it probably depends on the landscape. So if I'm looking in southeast Queensland and coastal environments for this work, probably the last 50, 75 years, and so in particular environments. I know there's been work in Savannah country looking at aerial photographs probably over a similar time frame. Other areas, it might just be occurring. So again, looking at Surrey Hills in Tassie, you're seeing evidence of that as well, but you are seeing changes in management strategies there. So Surrey Hills, which in Tassie is a plantation forestry, the managers there actually have to try and maintain and protect the grassland and open landscapes there as well. So I think you see responses there in different environments, and the rates will vary, I guess, depending on different areas.
I think again, just Yeah, just a thought, Melaleuca, I suppose incursion into sedgeland, particularly everywhere up the east coast, is quite significant from my experience. And that drives fire, which actually releases a lot more carbon into the atmosphere when it goes, compared to the sedge fires that used to be there in the 18th or Science of Classic, where photos in the 50s. So people used to walk across places now where if you want to try to walk across there now, you'd be lost forever in a sea of Melaleuca, Pimpernavia and Garnia grass. And that goes, when it burns with much higher intensity impacts, both human and natural environment. How is there any? I suppose that's one point I'd like to question. You know, where are we in common space? The other thing that I'm concerned about, I suppose, is we're not giving credit for managing forests to contain carbon so forth. Where forests are healthy and they're continuing to grow actively, they're actually locking carbon up, and we're not actually assessing or allowing for that, you know, by low intensity fire, keeping the carbon in the trees, rather than allowing them to be consumed in wildlife.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And actually, I'm having discussions with Kayak at the moment about 18 Mile Swamp, because they want to get an assessment of how much of the paperbark invasion's been occurring. They're particularly concerned with the swamp daisies, which is a threatened species, and the links with fire there as well. And I agree with you fully. I mean, that's one of the reasons for cool burns, is that you reduce the risk of those big devastating bush fires that are going to release a lot more carbon, and something we also need to sort of factor in there as well. The other thing is that which concerns me is with peatland systems, if they dry out and they start to go off, it's a whole different ball game in terms of trying to get them out as well.
The combination of not only the extreme fire, the heat driven out of the Melaleuca forest fire, but also the fact that the peat may all be dry at the same time.
Yeah, and that's where you'll have impacts. And we've got evidence, as I said, Moon Point, probably less degree jumping grass, but there's a layer where we've got big charcoal fragments in the Moon Point site, and basically I've lost 6,000 years of heat because it's basically been burnt down because of that event. And it seems to be associated with that sea level rise. So I think it changed water tables and things dried out, and basically, and it seems to be a regional impact as well in that. So yeah, but I agree with you that that's probably one of the other reasons for sort of looking at those management strategies in terms of carbon fluxes.
Any more questions at the moment from the floor? Yeah, Philippa?
Just thank you for your tour. I'm just curious, if I can't see all the fine print on your tables like this, when you say there's sudden spikes, what kind of a time frame are we looking at?
Okay, so here,
That's so dramatic.
so down here is probably about 45 to about 40,000, roughly. This one's about the last 5,000 years there. So there we go. That might, that probably help it. So, I mean, it's a complex situation. So this is the first record I've ever worked on Nostradbroke Island. So 2004, when I arrived in Brisbane. And I had this come up, and that's classic Lynch's Crater. So Lynch's Crater, I'm not sure how many people have heard of Lynch's Crater, but it's a site in Atherton Tableland. Peter Kershaw worked on it. Basically, big charcoal peak about 45,000 years ago. Vegetation change, people. So I saw this and thought, great, same story. I've got another record at, well, you probably see it actually at 18 Mile Swamp, but you know, we see our charcoal peak there at around about 9,000 years. There's a bit of a peak a little bit earlier, but we've got another one at Tortoise Lagoon, which pretty quiet at that time period, and a big peak at around about, I think it was about 12,000 years as well. Water reflects that variability in the landscape. So it's one of the things we've got to be cautious of. If we've got one record and try to tie it into that, we could go down a rabbit hole, basically. We need to get that landscape assessment of those different changes in fire regimes to understand that as well. And we're starting to get that spatial scale at Stradbroke Island and southeastern Queensland as well, which can feed into these situations. And it makes sense. This is probably where people were It's not too far from Little Canalpin and Wallen, where we've got continuous occupation for up to 50,000 years. Probably those sites on the high dunes, particularly 20,000 years ago, mightn't have been a great place. There mightn't have been a lot of water there or things like that. So, you know, and maybe rarer sites to visit mightn't have been the food resources there. So it's, you know, I think it's important to be very careful about using paleoecology to use one site to sort of apply it as a blanket ban. Lynch's quoted that has occurred. That's also an atypical environment. That's a rainforest. So that's not typical for most of Australia. So, you know, we've got to be very careful with that as well and build up the database, but it takes time to do that.
I think we are getting close to the time where we need to let Patrick have a rest, but is there a chat question?
We do have one question in Zoom. Did Aboriginal burning delay the monsoon in early climate change?
So everyone heard that? Did Aboriginal burning delay the monsoon?
All right. Probably don't know, but it's a good question. I can say in the wet tropics, so there was a delay in the return of rainforest. So we had climate amelioration probably around about 14,000 years ago, and the rainforest didn't come back to the wet tropics until about 9,000 years ago. So it's related to the monsoon, but there appears to have been, and if we look back at previous interglacial periods, so that transition from glacials to interglacials, it seems to be much more instantaneous. So from 130 to 120,000 years ago, it pretty much, rainforest came back. 9,000 years ago, it was delayed. And the key difference we have is people, basically. So I would say that there would probably be a role. There's a big debate about whether vegetation change associated with Indigenous burning limited the extent of the monsoon coming down south. So that vegetation, so we might have had channel country flooding more on a more regular basis, but we don't have the evidence. There's academics who would be strongly supportive of that. I'm going to sit on the fence and say I'm not sure. I think we need more data. We do have evidence, for instance, we've got longer records on Stradbroke Island. We do have more rainforest on Stradbroke Island, for instance, prior to 6,000 years ago. This seems to be linked to people, but we've also got megafauna going. We've got a range of other factors coming into play as well. So it's probably a factor and it's probably influencing things, but it's a complex debate and we need more data basically from key sites. What I'll say.
At that point, sorry, Dave, you did have another question, but can we save it till the break maybe? So look, we are at the time where we need to give Patrick a round of thanks. But look, before you do, I mean, this has given our forum this afternoon such a good overview of the concepts that we're looking at with fire management. But not only that, very, very impressive case studies going back so long and that he is working on currently in many parts of Australia. So thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing all that with us. Please join me in thanking Patrick. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our second speaker for this afternoon, Alistair Hartley. And if you've got your speaker bios there, you can have a look in full. I won't read it all out, but Alistair tells us that his lifelong journey really has been involved with fire management in various aspects, including some traditional burning with Indigenous folk. He's spent 13 years with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service and had a big role in the Carnarvon National Park area with creating patterns of vegetation there. And most recently, though, he's been working with Bush Heritage Australia on many sites of theirs, working on fire risk management profiles for Bush Heritage. So would you please join me in welcoming Alistair?
Good day, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I do talk a bit soft, so if I'm not talking loud enough, yell at me. I do realise that. So I've been with Bush Heritage for about 3 years now. So yeah. Welcome.
Is that too?
We'll just do it this way.
This one should work. Were you using that, Patrick? You weren't using that.
Geez, I managed to break it already. Doing well.
Okay, just use the enter.
That one,
Enter.
enter.
Yep.
Yep.
And then
Okay. That's not your next one, though. Is
No,
it?
it's not. It's gone.
Back one.
There we go.
No, I'll
There we
go
go.
and see if we can fix it.
Just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are meeting on and those in the online that are seeing on. I'm very lucky in my role. I get to work with First Nations people, Indigenous groups right across Australia. So I consider myself pretty lucky with that. But yeah, I'd like to acknowledge all their elders, past, present, and future. First, I thought I'd introduce a little bit about Bush Heritage because since joining Bush Heritage, as I say, 3 years ago, I've discovered that not many people know what we do. So we're a non-profit conservation organisation. We started 32 years ago in Tasmania. Founder was Bob Brown and with Liffey Valley, and he fundraised to buy Liffey Valley and save it. And from there, the model grew and grew. And now our impact is to make sure our impact is deep, sustainable, and collaborative with everyone. Our vision is healthy country protected wherever. Whoop. Too far. So we have 45 reserves across Australia. As I say, we work with quite a few Indigenous groups, got 31 Indigenous partnerships. So all of the orange ones are just some of our partnerships. The green ones are reserves, and we've got some regional and local partnerships as well. So as you can see, I work mainly in the top half of Australia, the northern half. So Kimberley's top end, and in Queensland, and a little bit into South Australia. Yay, I'm not breaking it. So I work across the landscape. One of the things that we do quite a bit.
I might ask you to do that. It's a little bit at the back. See if
Yep.
it's
They're working. Right.
that might be a little bit.
Hopefully that's better.
Is that all right at the back?
So I work across the landscape. I work across the reserves. Mainly look at fire issues, and I help get the fire issues done on the ground. So carry out prescribed burns, respond to wildfires, and that sort of thing. One of the things that we have started to do is we know that most of Australia's flora and fauna are well adapted to fire, as Patrick has indicated in his talk. And one of the things we know is to reduce the wildfire risk, if we do timely burning at with good soil moisture, we are likely to reduce the intensity of wildfires coming through. And we use this with a combination of traditional knowledge and science and practices, and we combine that with some of our Western science as well. We also know that being proactive in this space is better than reacting. It's a bit cheaper, it's a bit easier, it's a bit kinder to people. So one of the things with this slide is, this is from our Yorker Reserve up in North Queensland. On this side of the boundary, that's actually the wet tropics going up through here. And our reserve on the eastern side borders the wet tropics. The shading in green is some prescribed burns that the manager and my boss actually conducted earlier. This is from 2022. And they did these burns that are in green right in the wet season. So it's actually still raining at times, but they got some good burns in. Later in the year, we had the neighbour light the fire, which is this black area. It's a burn sky. And it burnt into our reserve. But using those practices of burning early, we're able to pull up the fire with myself and the reserve manager. And it basically pulled up on the burn scars from burning with the soil moisture. So this is an image of what I call and what we call a timely fire and a badly timed fire. So the timely fire is an image with lots of unburnt in between it, very large smoke. That smoke generally has got a bit more steam in it. It's not a lot of smoke in there, and is generating very little carbon as well. Opposed to the burn on the right, which has been done with low soil moisture and produces that kind of black landscape. Not a lot of space there for vegetation to recolonize, not places for little critters to survive either. One of the things we've also know is that by burning with badly timed fire with no soil moisture, it can lead to woody thickening as well. So by doing it with soil moisture, you increase your fuel structure. So your ladder fuels to the ground of the fire. By burning when you've got soil moisture, you're protecting the grasses, the grass roots, and you encourage grasses to come back. As I say, we work across Northern Australia predominantly. And this slide is from the North Australian Fire Information guys. They're based in the Charles Darwin University. We do a lot of work with universities. And we do quite a bit of work with Rowan Fisher and the NAFI guys. In this slide, they've actually shown that in 2000 and 2006, around 665,000 hectares were burnt before any good fire management was done. So the change there is that burning was done in 2015 to 2021. We started burning on the back of the wet season. So as soon as the wet season finished, as soon as the grass would light, we were in there burning, as opposed to 2000 when it was late dry season, big wildfires and big destruction. So a 52% reduction in wildfires and late dry season wildfires is what's being shown there. That's the green. We know that the landscape is adapted to fire. A lot of the early explorers described country as they were going through it as a gentleman's park, landscape park, or grassy park suitable for grazing. The descriptions go on and on. Read through them. We now believe that some of these landscapes, from the experience I've had, a lot of these landscapes could only have been created through regular burning. Every year, giving the country an opportunity to burn under the right conditions. One of the things that I often believe, and I spray quite a bit, is our job as fire people is to give the country the opportunity to burn at the right time. It will decide where it wants to burn. And in the Carnarvons, I would light up some of the same country time and time again, and every year, for 3 years in a row, it burnt different country. Never burnt the same country, yet I lit the same flight path. But the whole idea is that we don't want to burn everything. So this photo is a burn that I did in 2023, and it's actually in the Simpson Desert. It's spinifex country. It is on the back of soil moisture. The soil moisture there is around 20%. And you can see that we've got all the shrub layer fully intact. Those shrubs withstood the fire quite nicely, spinifex all around them. And we've got lots of unburnt country all through these burn areas. So lots of hiding holes for various fauna and recolonisation from the spinifex. Patrick touched on it briefly, but the lack of fire does create hazards. And we have seen that, and we do see that. We know that the landscape needs to be burnt, but we also know that there are areas that should not be burnt, or we need long burnt areas. So 2, 3, 4, 5 years of long unburnt, sometimes 10 years, the obligate seeders to get through and regenerate. But at some point, they will need fire. If we don't burn, we end up with fuel roads and fuel structures to the canopy that cause these horrendous wildfires. So the picture up in the bottom here, that's a wildfire with a fuel structure right from it was full leaf on the ground, right through to the crown, and very fast moving, very difficult to control. This photo up here, that's actually at 8 o'clock at night with a fire still crowning at 8 o'clock at night. And that's in the Carnarvon Ranges where that country hadn't been burned for 2 years. So sometimes our burn regimes need to be much shorter than what we think. And 2 years in the Carnarvon Ranges is a long unburnt.
The rainfall amount in that 2-year period, do you know what it was?
It was around the 600 mil mark. So
Average, is that normal?
that's about average, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So I'll touch on some of that rainfall a bit later, but yeah. One of the things that we do find is burn windows. There's lots of talk about burn windows getting smaller. I would contend that on traditional Western European way of burning, government ways of burning, where we tend to burn in winter, and I'm as much as fault as well. We used to do that in parks. We're burning some of our forestry in July. Really, it's a clear day, without frost, let's get out and burn. But because of climate change, we know that those windows are getting shorter and shorter. And now you might have 5 of those days. If you're lucky, you'll have 10 of those days a year.
But that's the really low wind.
Yep, they're getting shorter and shorter. I would contend that those are probably not our perfect burning days. And we should be looking at soil moisture. One of the things that we look at in bush heritage is our baseline of 7% root zone soil moisture. If we got 7% soil moisture or greater, and I used to do this when I was in parks and Carnarvons, we will go and drop a match. We will go and burn. And that means our windows for burning are now months. So this photo up here, up in this top picture, that's in Northern Territory. It's the Western top end. That's in April, still in the wet season. As you can see, there's still water in the landscape. That river is normally dry. There's lots of water holes. The country is very green. That bottom picture is the same country. I've just blown a bit further away. That country is still green. The grass is still green, but it's still burning. Now, I contend that that is potentially a model that we could be looking at to be burning with 7% soil moisture or greater, thereabouts. Then we're going to be able to have more windows to burn and greater windows. And working with Indigenous groups, it's what they keep talking about is burning when there's moisture, burning when we've got green grass. It only is too wet if the batch won't light it. If it'll still burn, then it's still good to go. By doing this, we also found out that wildfires become easier to manage. The burn scars and the burn areas are not 100% burn areas, but they're big enough and they're good enough that they'll slow down and reduce the intensity of a wildfire, so it becomes a low intensity wildfire, and we don't have to worry about it, still keep an eye on it, or it will actually stop the wildfire. These places also become a refuge for various fauna, small beasts, animals and that, to go and hide come wildfire season. These two images are from a wildfire in the Carnarvon Ranges from October last year. Some of you might have heard about this fire. Our reserve is actually, I'll try and use this and not break it. This is our reserve down in here and in here. So this is a burn scar that the reserve manager, put in earlier in the year based on soil moisture. He had 10% root zone soil moisture. From memory, it was about May last year they put that fire in. It trickled around. It had a maximum flame of height of around 1 meter from memory, and went out at night. The main wildfire, which is the dark country, that's all this country, and then here, that was started in the middle of September in 23. It burnt for 4 or 5 weeks, got within 50 kilometres of Springshaw in the end. But you'll notice that this area here hasn't burnt. That was a fire that was put in by National Parks early in the year, the same time that we put ours in. And you'll see along this boundary here that this fire has stopped on that burn scale. So that's an example of what I'm talking about with burn areas, burn scales. We do this quite a bit in Northern Australia, across Cape York, the Gulf Country, Top End, and the Kimberleys. And we're also trying to do it in the desert country now as well. Some of the places that are fire adapted might also surprise you. So I want to talk a bit about this place. Patrick has done some work at Edgbaston. Edgbaston is in central Queensland. It's just northeast of Aramac. We were asked by the reserve staff to please come in and look at burning these springs, because there's a redfin blue eye. They're only found in there. It's a little fish. They're only found in these springs. So the whole idea was just to burn the springs, just so that they could treat the gambusia. Now, the gambusia is a mosquito fish, and it preys on the redfin blue eye. It's a major threat to the fish. So they wanted us to burn the springs down to water level so they could treat the springs and kill all the gambusia, fence them off so that there was no reinfestation, and then reintroduce the redfin blue eye. It took me 5 or 6 goes before I figured out what the right conditions were for the burning. So we're talking about a high intensity fire, but a low severity. So under the flame in the top right picture is water. That's all water through all of this. So when I say a high intensity fire, because of the water, it reduces the severity. We have had success, great success. We've reintroduced redfin blue eye, and we've done that to 13 springs now. But we've also found some interesting side effects which we didn't account for. These springs are highly adapted to fire, we now think. Having some sort of interference seems to be a good thing for a spring. We've now found recruitment of black tea tree and coolabah from these fires. You go to these springs and there's coolabah seedlings everywhere, to the extent that we now think we might have to put fire back in so that we can reduce the thickening of the coolabah and the tea tree. We've taken out reduced the density of the Phragmites, and the result has been an increased flow on the spring bends. So the springs are now getting bigger. There's more flow there. More interestingly, is we've got a greater diversity of spring flora. So we've got endangered parbworts, myophyllum, rhygiums, bladderworts, and whatever else. Some of them are endangered, some of them are only found at Edgbaston. So what I'm saying is this is an example that just because it looks wet doesn't mean it didn't have fire in it. And to me, it's a great example that fire in Australia, or the Australian landscape, is actually adapted to fire more than you might actually realise.
On the slide, I should really be into that. In the period before you started in fires there, had there been a long period without any fire?
Yeah, sorry about that. The property had been grazing property for 100 plus years. So yeah, quite a long time. I can't tell you off the top of my head. I'll have to get back to you on that one, but yeah. So these two slides are before or a spring that I burnt. One is before I actually lit it up, and the other one's the after effect. They're not great photos, I do apologize, but basically the thing I want to stand out is those 4 trees. Even though the fire was high intensity, they survived. And they became the seeding stock for the regeneration that come along. All that country there is it's got water underneath it. The line that you see through here is for the springs, the fencing that stops the reinfestation of the gambusia. So all this work is done with volunteers and reserve staff, so I'll add. Probably the controversial part of my talk. So what do I see that we can change? One of the things that sticks in my mind is a saying by Rita Brown: insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The reason why that sticks in my mind is one of the things that I've seen every 10 years, we seem to have big fires in Southeast Australia. After 300 mil of rainfall in the desert, we have big fires. 18 months to 2 years after 300 mil of rainfall, we have big fires. But we expect a different result, but we're not doing anything different. And maybe we need to educate society, have society get used to having smoky days, but maybe we burn when there's soil moisture to reduce how dense the smoke is, and we can have a bit of a breeze to blow the smoke away quicker. The atmosphere is designed and set up so that smoke goes up and doesn't just sit in the valleys. We also need to teach people the benefits of having fire in the landscape. I get pulled up quite often when people realise that I'm in the fire game. And I have everything from you're killing the bush, don't put fire in, through to best thing ever. And when I explain to people what it is I'm actually doing and what I do when I go out there, it starts changing people's perspective. And people start to get a better understanding and a bit more of an appreciation for how adaptable their landscape is. And if we can change and not do the same thing over and over again, then maybe we can stop having scenes like this. So that's that wildfire that I showed you from Carnarvon last year. That's the end result of the Crown Fire. That was in excess of 20 tonnes per hectare of fuel with a structure from the ground to the canopy. We know that climate change is going to be a driver of fire weather days, and it's also going to be a driver of when our opportunities to burn are going to be. So one of the things that we look at is we know bad fire weather days are on the increase, but we look for non-traditional times, so not those winter times to burn, but other times outside. So maybe in the middle of summer, we've had enough rainfall that we can put a fire into the landscape safely. And so that's what we've done. And I've done it in the Carnarvons when I was in parks as well a few times, where in the middle of summer, we went and dropped matches because we'd had 3 inches of rain. And we had the best burns that I've ever seen. I also think, sorry,
but when you say best, the killing regrowth, what is best?
Okay, so the best is not having to put resources in to control it. It's just taken out the grass layer, it's left a duff layer. It hasn't been a canopy fire, it's left some shrubs, it's left some unburnt country, and it burnt some country. It's left a mosaic of burnt and unburnt country throughout the landscape. But it hasn't been a roaring fire and killed everything. So, yeah, that's what I mean. One of the things I also think we should do is work closer. Agencies should work closer with some of our scientists and and use sim models as part of an education tool. So as I say, we work quite closely with the guys at NAFI, and I'll give a shameless plug to them. They're really good guys. But NAFI is for those that don't know, it's a fire monitoring website. You can click on it and it will give you an indication of where fires are, what they're doing, and that sort of thing. Government agencies use them all the time, but unfortunately they don't provide any funding, and those guys are struggling for funding all the time. So I'll give a shameless plug to them because they're good guys and they provide a valuable tool to any fire practitioner in the northern half of Australia. But one of the things that they've been doing, and the next slide is a video of a sim model that we've been working with them on. Fingers crossed it works. So this is for Nitmillock National Park. It's just an example, but it can be done anywhere in Australia. We can plug in vegetation types. We can plug in some fire history of where burns have happened in the last 1, 2, 5 years. We can put in names. We can put in various fire dangers, wind, weather, that sort of thing. As this one says, bad fire weather with an accidental fire, and what happens. Pretty big fire, it gets going pretty well. And then we can plug in a scenario. So what if we put a burner fire break in the landscape? Something we do quite a bit in the north of Australia, but something that we can do on smaller scale, I believe, on the East Coast as well. This is putting a fire in good soil moisture. And potentially that's what we could end up having. Makes the fire more controllable. We're not having to fight it on 360 degrees. We only have to fight it on one front, or try and contain it on one front.
So how often would you be doing that?
For Nitmillock, those guys would be doing those kind of burns every year. We do, so to the northeast of Nitmillock, we've got partnerships to the northeast. We do that kind of burning with them every year, about May, late April, early May. So what we find is in northern Australia, the Kimberleys dry out first after the wet season. And so I'll be up there with those guys, giving them a hand, generally mid-April. The creeks are still running, you're still getting bogged, getting full of mud, leeches, and whatever else. That's great. But the fires go and they're contained by these drainage lines that have got water in them. The grass is still green. Not everything burns, but what burns will burn. And we just keep going. And we do lots of little fires. It's not one big fire that burns out 300,000 hectares. Lots of little fires that will eventually burn out 300,000 hectares with lots of refugia, lots of unburned country, but lots of country that's connected with burn scars. So when wildfires come in, as in they can be contained. And by being proactive and doing this sort of work, reduces our cost to respond to wildfires.
So when you say every year, is it generally in the same larger area and you just let it go where it goes?
Yes.
But you're doing small patches within.
Yeah. I believe we can, an example in the southeast corner of Queensland, the Diaglo National Park, similar sort of techniques could be used there if it depends on soil moisture, burn those sort of areas. It'll protect those suburbs on the western sides there from any potential wildfires. You could do something similar to that. Where I live in the top of the Lockyer Valley, in the Helidon Hills, that sort of technique would work quite well there too, I think. So, yeah. Not quite the end. One of the other things that I see as a challenge, and I say this coming from working in a government department, is changing the agency's mindset from being from response driven to being proactive driven. I say that because a lot of the funding for government agencies, Parks and Wildlife is the same, Forestry is the same, comes from responding. If you have a wildfire and you don't have your brakes, you haven't for wildfire, you haven't got the money to be able to grade your fire breaks. You have the wildfire, you suddenly have the money to go and grade those breaks. It's asked about face, in my way of thinking. And we have $1 billion industry built around response. Now, I've just come from APAC, that's where those photos are from. At APAC, it really stood out to me. Bush Heritage and the Kimberley Land Council had a joint stand, and then there was one other company that had a stand, and we're the only ones talking about proactive fire management. Everyone else was about response. I would suggest that maybe we should try and build an industry around being proactive. And possibly the Savannah carbon method is a start to something along those lines of creating an industry where those that are being proactive get rewarded. Because at the moment, there's no reward for being proactive. I'm sure Lee's going to talk a little bit about this maybe, but also reducing the red tape, the amount of red tape. I've found, being on this side of the fence, there is a lot of red tape that we've got to get through to be able to get a burn done. That red tape, it's my job to get through it, so I'll get through it. But if you're a general landholder, I can see why it gets frustrating. But if we can reduce the red tape, it might open up some of those opportunities as they come up as well. And those people that are working in the landscape, if we can have them understand to burn at the right time and understand why they're burning. So that they're not just burning for burning's sake, but why are they burning? Are they burning to reduce fuel loads? Are they burning for ecological reasons? Are they burning to protect cultural sites or tourism sites or whatever else? Oh, wrong one, wrong way, sorry. And that's in the Mars little spiel. That's a Simpson Desert, photo of sunset and the Simpson Desert. So
from the deep past, evidence of past fire and what people have done in the distant past, to the very present and some great examples of fire management now and what we might do. So we have some time for questions to, yeah, okay.
I have a very,
as long as they're not difficult questions.
I have a very basic question because I'm not a geographer. How do you measure soil moisture, and have you got a device that goes from paddock to paddock?
So there is that's a really good question actually. There is two ways you can measure soil moisture. There is a device, a probe, you can go and stim the ground, but that's labour intensive. But we have these things up in the sky, satellites, that actually measure the soil. They measure the greenness of the vegetation, but they can also measure or can give you an idea of the soil moisture right across this country. That's on the Bureau of Meteorology site. And we just go in there and you can actually plug into there a geographical location, like a spot, lat long, that's a word, thank you. Put in a lat long and it will give you the soil moisture, estimated soil moisture for that country. And it's just another tool in the toolbox.
James Hanson, Alistair, thank you for that. I've got a related question in relation to soil moisture. What are the differences between what level you have before you burn and immediately afterwards, from point of view of retaining moisture in the soil and preventing further outbreaks?
Yep. Okay, so we know that at 7% soil moisture or below, you start having like a wildfire conditions. It becomes very difficult to control. If you're over 7%, particularly if you're in the 10s, you tend to retain the duff layer. So you're not burning right down to the ground, and so you retain some of your soil moisture. And it also means that your roots, the fire doesn't heat the ground up when you've got that soil moisture. It doesn't heat the ground up. It means that roots and things like that can't carry fire underground. And there's also sap going through the trees. And you would have noticed I didn't talk at all about the trees. Because when you've got that soil moisture, you've got sap flowing in your trees, and that means that your trees are going to be protected. If you look after the grass, you're going to look after your trees, and you're not going to have those underground fires on tree roots or stumps and things like that.
You also have the fungi, of course, surviving where they go.
Yeah, and that's it as well. So, yeah. You have all those microorganisms living in that layer. You're not killing them. You retain that soil health. And if anything, you promote it because you're getting that fine ash that goes back into the soil and provides more nutrients and organic matter for those microorganisms. When you have that, when you burn when there's less than 7%, you take away using all that fuel. That fire will consume all that fuel, and there's no organic matter for those microorganisms to survive on, if they survive the fire.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alistair. Alistair, is there a risk with the fuel fires that you, I think, just advocating there that you're actually going to end up with thickening, or do you need to start putting hot fires in as well?
I think there's a place for both, to be honest, and that's kind of also why I allude to moving away from winter burning and that cool burning and burning on soil moisture, because then it allows that variability in intensity, that natural intensity to happen as well. And so, and it also reduces, when you burn with soil moisture, it reduces the opportunity for woody thickening to occur, because you're giving the grasses the opportunity to outcompete the woody stems. But there is times when you will need to put in a slightly higher intensity fire, yeah, or more severe fire, I should say, not necessarily more high intensity.
Thanks, Alistair. Greenstone. We have a pastoral industry, trying to get from the room here, that uses the herbivores, the domestic livestock use the dry matter.
Yep.
All through the dry season. We also have native herbivores, and obviously if you burn that early, the drought stores and the product that the animals consume is gone. It's not like change or soil moisture, but basically the growing season's over. And we also have a woody thickening issue as well. So there's a bit of conflict there. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, not the elephant in the room, because I've worked with quite a few. Bush Heritage actually works in the ag sector. We have a whole team that works with various agricultural families, and we do talk about this with them. Your point is exactly right. If we've got the soil moisture, and that's what I say, if we've got soil moisture, it opens up those windows, and we could potentially burn in spring and get better quality feed, more feed come through in those spring, summer months. And by burning with that soil moisture, it also protects that feed from any fires that come in later in the season. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, just your comments on the obvious.
Yeah, I see this sort of fire management, and a lot of the principles that I use and that Bush Heritage uses is from our traditional principles. It's that traditional knowledge, and I can see that as a benefit to creating healthier or increasing the soil health for grazing enterprises as well. So, yeah.
Quick question in two parts. Do you measure fuel loads at all?
If we had enough people in our team, we would. Measuring fuel loads can be very time consuming. We do use a book, now I can't think of the name of it, which is basically a visual indicator. It's been accepted by a couple of the fire agencies, and yeah, we use that as a guide.
And also, given you're managing the Northern Australia and properties, has anybody looked at doing soil carbon 13 profiles in the woody areas? Because they quickly show up where you've changed woody vegetation, steep or grasses. It's quite a powerful technique.
Yeah.
For looking at that change.
Not that I know of. It was talked about at the recent conference in Darwin, the Carbon Industry Network conference. but not that I know of.
Thanks, Alistair. Cool training you. Any other indicators other than soil moisture that you use to help drive what is a good day to put fire on country?
Yeah, we do. We use all the obvious ones like temperature, wind, relative humidity. Then we also use plants as well. So, pardon me, one of the indicators, for example, with burning in the desert is when the gidgee is going to flower. So we don't want to burn when the gidgee is flowering or after it's flowered. So we try and burn before that. But we burn after the spinifex has gone to seed. That way there's actually seed in the ground and that sort of thing. So we use plant indicators as well. Yeah. The other thing we'll look at is what weather events are coming up. For the desert, we try and do the time of burning, so we've got good southerlies burning, mainly because it's sand dunes or north-south. We want the fires to run along the swales, but also we get a stable weather atmosphere then. And so the fires are less likely to be unpredictable, and the smoke is more likely to dissipate a lot easier.
Yeah, Christopher's in. Two-part question again. One, how do you light the fires and how do you put them out if you have to? And two, you showed us that map of Northern Australia. On an annual basis, how much of that land would be burned?
Okay, the first part is the bit I enjoy, lighting. We use everything. So in Northern Australia, and out in the desert, I'll use aircraft and we'll use aerial incendiary. We'll use drip torches, matches. We use a machine that's actually been created in North Queensland called 2 Easy Fire Stick. Really great device, and it's great that it's a Queensland invention. And we use that as well to light up areas quickly and where we need to. To fight fires, we try and use the burn areas to tie fires in. So if we've got two burn areas and the fire's coming in between them, we'll go in and try and link that using backpack blowers and a bit of lighting and try and link the two burn areas so fire burns into there. We're a small agency, a small organisation. There's only 260 of us and 60 of the staff are fire trained. We don't have huge budgets, so we do things on a shoestring, but we try and be as efficient as we can. So we'll burn off breaks if we need to. We try not to do a direct attack, but yeah, we'll try and use the landscape where we can. Sorry, what was the second one?
In terms of that map of North,
yep, okay.
How much would you burn?
I'd say probably 50% of it in the early dry season. So right on the back of, as soon as that country is dry enough for it to take, mobs will be out there dropping matches and trying to burn. And they'll use the landscape to create different burn areas, let the fire burn into a creek that's still got water in it and it's still running. Once it dries out, people try not to do too much burning. So.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Great lecture again. I'm a member of the State Bushfire Committee, and I really relate strongly to your points about the whole state instrument being a $1 billion state department, and that very much driven by response, not by proactive. Because we've been applying some pressure on that in the last 18 months, and it's starting to be a shift that now created the Rural Fire Services, separated from QFES, and they're now moving toward much more contact with ag industry, which is positive. But we need these presentations in the State Bushfire Committee, and so I'll try and, if I can, to organise a couple of session times in the State Bushfire Committee to have these presentations. So,
yep, sure. Yeah. Nice, yeah.
More work for you. I think We've got one more there, one more there, then we're going to have a break, I think. Okay.
I apologise if someone's already asked this question when I was out there. From your bio, I see you've been involved in these carbon credits for burning type things. I'm just wondering, do you find that there's enough flexibility? Are they on board with you burning when it's moist rather than when an annual fire regime or whenever they want?
That whole carbon industry is built around that flexibility, I think, when it's appropriate. So in general, very general terms, it's complicated, and I struggle to get my head around it to be able to explain it properly. So I'm going to be very general with the description, but for each part of Northern Australia, there's a cut-off time or a date of when burns need to be done by, because after that date, they are considered late dry season fires, and therefore wildfires, and therefore putting out carbon, which is opposite of what we're trying to do. And if we do our burns in the early dry season, so we've still got soil moisture, so dry season is a bit of a misnomer. But when we're put those fires in the early dry season, we're not putting carbon up, we're putting steam up. There might be a little bit of carbon, but it's negligible. But we're creating fire breaks to protect ourselves from any late dry season wildfires, to protect those carbon credits. So does that make sense? So, yeah.
Okay, final question before afternoon.
Thanks very much, Alistair. I'm Duncan Cook from Australian Catholic University, and yeah, it was just fascinating, I think, to see the work you're involved with, very much at the coalface. Indeed, we could probably say the charcoal face. And one thing I'm particularly interested in is, I think, areas of overlap or collaboration as a geographer, connecting this important work we have from the past, developing these scientific records of the behaviour of vegetation, fire and climate over longer periods of time, right, as important back context to what we're seeing today. And, you know, for people like yourself who are out in these landscapes today and working often, I think, at quite local scales and bringing in really localized sources of information, do you think there's ways that we can draw on that to say, these are also landscapes where perhaps we should be targeting for broader geographical research, paleo-environmental research, like kind of identifying gaps where we can connect the past with what you're doing today, the present?
I think so. I know that there's been a bit of work in the Arafura swamp up in the top end with some core drilling. You might know about it, Patrick, or have heard about it. I'm not totally au fait with it, but it's tied in to demonstrate current burning practices are similar to what was occurring a few thousand years ago. Yeah, I don't know much about that project, but there definitely is. And from my perspective, if we can have information from the past to help feed us for the future, that's great. If we can learn from the way things are done in the past, it might improve our knowledge and improve our ability and adaptability to go forward in the future. And one of the things that I've meant to say, and I forgot to say too, is if we become a bit more proactive in our fire management, I also see that it increases the resilience of our communities. One of the costs that I've seen is big fire comes through, we've got to rebuild the town or the community, we've got to support the community, we've got to make it resilient, and all these other factors. But if we're proactive in our fire management, we don't have to have those additional costs of mental health and all that other stuff. We've built a resilient community already because we've got this good fire management, proactive fire management. And so we're reducing costs and pressure on our economy as well, on that side of it as well. So, yeah.
Can I just ask how many volunteers as opposed to paid staff do you have in the BHA?
I'll have to get back to you on that. There's heaps, yeah.
Heaps of volunteers.
Heaps of volunteers.
So it's mostly volunteers.
Mostly volunteers.
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Yeah, that's. I would say, as a guess, be a few thousand, yeah.
Yeah, so it is, but mostly voluntary.
And we're 100% funded through philanthropy.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, fully private, we're non-government affiliated. We're just about doing the best we can for the land and
such excellent work that you're doing on that
Yeah.
basis.
and working collaboratively with our neighbours. So at Aramac with Edgbaston, we work with our neighbours there. I did a burn in the Mitchell grass because the neighbours were asking can we improve our Mitchell grass, and they weren't sure, and I had some ideas. So we put the Mitchell grass on the reserve as a trial so that they weren't sacrificing it and they could look over the fence. And next month I'm going back to, and we're going to start talking a bit more collaboratively about burning Mitchell grass and improving their Mitchell grass health. So, yeah.
How's Mitchell grass go?
Good. It come back really good. And we actually found that because we got buffalo grass there, by burning it, with that buffalo grass hayed off, but the Mitchell grass has gone to seed, but still had green shoots. The Mitchell grass outcompeted the buffalo.
So as the last question from Duncan, how do we join the perspectives of our two speakers here this afternoon? The very long time scale that Patrick has talked about with the very current work that is being done by BHA. So that's a very interesting point for geographers too, because we're always looking at ways for mapping different things. But look, can you please join me in thanking our two speakers here?